Good morning. Thank you, Daxton, for that good reading. Our young men do a fine job, don't they? Caesarea. I want to talk about Caesarea, and I've been waiting to do this ever since we got back, and I kind of thought I would relegate these to Sunday nights, but this one I thought, since Sunday nights seem to be at a premium these days, I'm going to do this morning. It's got a spiritual message I want to bring closer to the end of the lesson. However, I've got a couple of commercials to do first. I'm not selling anything. Tonight, Kim Wall is going to speak for us again. And he's bringing another series in his Evolution's Destruction. Wait a minute. Evolution's, what is it called? Evolution's Extinction Engine. That's what it is. And I've been fascinated with these. It's been great. Now, think about what David said about 3,000 BC, or 3,000 years ago, 1,000 BC. He said, the heavens do what? They declare the glory of God, and the firmament is showing his handiwork. Now, if the heavens are making a declaration, shouldn't we hear that? And if the firmament, the handiwork of God, is showing us something, shouldn't we pay attention to that? Then Paul would come along about 1,000 years after David, and he would say, those who say there is no God are without excuse, because the creation shows us his great and powerful Godhead. And when we look at the creation, that's what we're doing tonight. We're looking at the lessons from the creation. And Kim is expert at bringing those to us, as he was at bringing us the Lord's Supper this morning. So, the second commercial, men's class or men's Bible study this coming Tuesday night, 8 o'clock. Be there if you can. If you haven't been there before, don't worry about it. Come on, we're studying James. So bring your Bible, bring your unhealthy snacks, and let's have a good time together. We'll see you at 8 o'clock this coming Tuesday night. It's been great. All right, let's talk about Caesarea. Somewhere, there it is. Let's see if this works. Am I still on? Can you hear me? Yes. All right, good. There's Caesarea right there on the coast of it. Now, what do you notice about the coast of Israel here? It is a straight line. You wouldn't think there would be any kind of a deep water port there, but Herod fixed that. Herod the Great did that. He fixed a deep water port. We'll see about that in just a second. And this looks like it would be beach all the way. I was surprised, though, as we were along the coast in a couple of different places. It's not quite as straight as you would think. It's a beautiful coastline looking out into the Mediterranean. But that's where the city of Caesarea is located. Should I advance or will you advance? All right, and I'll do it. Here we go. See if it works. Ha, it worked. I've had more technical problems with this presentation than you can imagine. Caesarea Maritima. Now, I say that because it's got to be distinct from Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is up to the northeast. A couple of towns named Caesarea. Imagine why they're named Caesarea. People wanted to honor Caesar with the name of their town, and so that's what they did. So they called these towns Caesarea of one kind or another. And this is a view from the air, obviously, of Caesarea Philippi. Now, we'll talk about the deep water port. I'll show you a little bit of that more about in a minute. Back in 350 BC, this city was founded by the Phoenicians. They were great seafaring people. And Herod the Great came along. He ruled from 37 to 4 BC, and he gave this city its great prominence. He was a builder par excellence. He was as good a builder as he was a rotten egg. He was a really bad guy. He did a lot of bad things to a lot of people, especially his own family. It's what was the saying? It's safer to be a dog in the street than to be one of Herod's sons or something like that. Something along those lines. I didn't think about that until I got up here. Yeah, that's a good quote. I should have used that in this. But he built this deep water port from 29 to 9 BC. It took him 11 years. And this is where that port would be. Nope, don't advance this yet. This wasn't there naturally. This was not there naturally. Herod got this plan, got a bunch of engineers together. They built barges, and they loaded those barges with cement that would work underwater and with rock and dirt. And they would float those barges out to where they wanted these jetties to be, and they would sink them. And they sank enough of them until they eventually had land, and they built out on these jetties and came up with a wall, and they had a gate. They even had a lighthouse out there. We'll show you that in a little bit. It was pretty cool. They had a deep water port that would allow for hundreds of ships to come in and load and unload. It was a great feat of engineering. And so he did that in those 11 years. His point was to impress Rome, and boy, did he impress Rome. He made a lot of friends at Rome. But his point was also that this harbor would mean that if he wanted to communicate with Rome or get communications from them, he had the means. Seafaring was the quickest way to get messages across the Mediterranean, of course, and so they would get on a ship, take off, get a message to Rome, get a message back from Rome, and they could do that here with a deep water port. This was something new. It hadn't been done, or if it had, it hadn't been done very often. This is a brand new thing, and it was very exceptional, and it made Caesarea a port to the world. It connected Israel to the world because this, of course, was on the coast of Israel. So think about that with regard to what we'll look at a little bit later. Here is an artist's conception of what it might have looked like. Here are those jetties that came off. Here's one on one side, and here is another. And you see out here's the lighthouse. There is where the ships would have entered the harbor. And there were docks along here. This was a great advantage for all kinds of commerce to take place. Up here, see that aqueduct? We'll take a look at that in just a minute. There was no fresh water in the area of Caesarea, so they went about 5 miles north to the base of Mount Carmel. You remember Mount Carmel, where Elijah had this battle, more or less, with the prophets of Baal, 850 prophets of Baal? That's where that water is coming from. They built that aqueduct that goes all the way up there, and that provided water for the city. Up here, the Greek amphitheater is where that was located. We did not go up to see those ruins, but we did see the ruins of this Roman theater. We'll show you that in a little bit. And they're not as much ruins. They've rebuilt a lot of that so that because they still have performances there in the theater. The difference, by the way, I didn't know this, the difference between a theater and an amphitheater is that the Greek word amphi means a circle or means round. And so an amphitheater goes all the way around, whereas a theater is just a half circle. And of course they have it enclosed because that's where the actors and the performers would be, right in there. You might think, why tell us all about that? Well, this shows what kind of a prominent city this was. Caesarea was the capital of this area of Judea, and it was a very important city, and Herod made it that way. Here is the hippodrome. I'll show you another picture of that in a minute. We'll talk about what a hippodrome is. Some of you may already know. But I want you to notice a couple of things. Here is, what is that? That's the Temple of Augustus. Right there's the temple, but out here is the amphitheater, and there is the theater. Any idea why the theaters would be outside the city wall? Reason is believed that Herod knew the Jewish population would be upset at the things that took place in the theater and the amphitheater. And so they did not allow those to be built within the city wall. Those were kept outside the wall to try to keep some peace because of all the bawdy, violent things that took place in those places. However, the temple was there. It seems that religion was different than entertainment. And so you can have a temple in town, but you can't have the theaters. Now there is an august group of travelers if I have ever seen one. Isn't it interesting? There's Gary and Juice. They are traveling to the Philippines today. Gary was something else. He's in his 70s. You know that, don't you? And everywhere we went, he went. He was bound and determined. He was going to climb every hill we climbed, and we did a lot of climbing. It's kind of like, I remember now hearing all these stories from our parents that when they went to school when they were kids, it was uphill both ways in 4 feet of snow. It was kind of like, except here was in 150 degrees, uphill both ways. But Gary climbed everywhere we climbed, and he went through, I don't have any pictures of this because it was dark in there, he went through Hezekiah's tunnel. I don't know if you're familiar with Hezekiah's tunnel, but it's a tunnel he dug through limestone to provide water for the city of Jerusalem to prevent siege overcoming them. But Gary went through that. He was some kind of a traveler. This is a great bunch of people. There is Debbie's sister, Sherry. She's the one who funded the trip for us. She said, I want to go to Israel, but I don't want to go alone. Will you guys go? If you go, I'll pay your way. And we said, well, let's think about it. So we went. It was a great trip. We had a wonderful time. There, of course, is our daughter Jamie and our grandson Liam. He's a great traveler. If you ever want to go on a trip and take somebody who's never going to complain and always going to be smiling, call Liam, see if he'll go with you, because that's what he was on this trip. It was great. Here is our guide, Michael. He is Israeli. He's ex-military Israeli. Of course, if you're not dying and you're an Israeli, you're going to be in their military for some time. And he's a great guide. They had to study for 2 years to become a guide, so he knew his stuff. And he led us all over the place and showed us some really cool things. There is part of the aqueduct, 5 miles long. Can you imagine building those arches for 5 miles? And of course, what they would do is they would build a wood frame in the shape of an arch, and then they would stack the stones on top of that. And when they got the arch, one arch made, they would take down that wood frame and move it to the next spot and build another one. So it was a great feat of engineering, and it was a lot of things I was impressed with over there. So you got 125,000 people or so living in Caesarea. You need water for them, and this aqueduct provided all the water they needed and more. Herod built this aqueduct to bring fresh water from the closest springs, which were several kilometers to the north at the foot of Mount Carmel. I mentioned that a little while ago. But the reason they did this is because they were not well people. Okay, we'll move along. You didn't get it? Not well people? If they had a well, they wouldn't need springs. Okay, all right. This is the aqueduct as it looks today. Here's a pretty good stretch of it. It's not 5 miles long. It doesn't still go all the way to Carmel, but that's what it looks like today. Well, at least that's what it looked like in September. And everywhere we went, there were these structures that were built with large stones, and I kept reminding myself, they didn't have diesel engines. They didn't have steam engines. They built these things by hand. Everything. If it wasn't slave labor, it was somebody being paid to haul rocks and stack rocks, and they did a lot of marvelous engineering things. By the way, how old is that? That's 2,000 years old. They built things to last. It's going to work eventually. There we go. That doesn't show up. I hope that shows up better on the monitors. Can you see what those are? They look like man-made caves. Those are storage areas for all of the goods that would come into that port. Herod said, if we're going to have a port, we're going to have storage. This is your first century Amazon Prime, basically is what that was. I mean, I know it sounds like a joke, but really you think about it. If you want to get something from another part of the world, you send to get that. You have to send an emissary. You send the letter. You send somebody to get it. It's got to come in somewhere. And so when it came to Caesarea, it was a lot closer to Jerusalem than most other ports. It saved a lot of money, and you could bring stuff in, you could store it, you could sell it. It was a great economical boon to have this deep water port at Caesarea. And Herod spared no expense. This is a map that shows all these places from which he brought stone. Whoever had the best stone of a particular kind, particular type, he would send there. He would have that stone brought in, and they would offload it. There's about the area where Caesarea would be, and they would use it in the building of this great city. Here's the theater. Note the size of it. Seats about 4,000 people. These seats, all these you see here, have basically been refurbished from the original. They were there in stone, but it was rough, and so they refurbished it because they wanted to use it. As you can see, this is a modern setup. They still have performances here all the time. So that is the refurbished theater that was just south of the city, if you recall. Here's another picture of it from the air. By the way, there's one of those jetties. Also, you can see on this jetty, that square area there, if you can tell that, that was a pool in the courtyard of Herod's palace. He had his palace out on one of these. That's how substantial those jetties were. They went out into the sea, and they were enclosed on the end, and it became a deep water port, and it was a boon. By the way, there's, I think that right there is, maybe that's it. That's the Hippodrome. Talk about that here in a second. The theater in its heyday, I don't know how well you can see this picture, but this is a picture of what it probably would have looked like, because this is how they built theaters. It was a couple of different levels. You can see the seats down inside. So it was been a massive structure, and very ornate, very lavish, very elaborate, and that's what Herod wanted. He taxed the people so he could build things that would impress Rome, and that's how he got his standing as a leader of the Jewish people for the Romans. Of course, if you're going to have public facilities, you're going to have public bathrooms, and that's what these are. And, women, they got to go to the bathroom together. They can't just go one at a time. So, yeah, it looks like these stones, you just sit on top of these stones, and I'm not sure exactly how this worked, but that's what they told us that these things were. Of course, it's been 2,000 years. They don't look exactly like they did then, but that's what these were. They even had restrooms. And of course, if you want to keep your city clean, you've got to have something going on like that. And so Herod even provided for that. I told my daughter, I said, Jamie, send me some pictures, the ones that are obviously the good ones of these places, but send me also the human interest. I think that was a human interest one, just to know, what are you going to do about going to the bathroom? Everybody wants to know that. Here's a view of the Hippodrome. This is where they raced hippos. Just keep in mind, come on, there we go. Hippo, that's the Greek word for horse. So they would race horses here, but not just horses. They would race horses connected to chariots. They would have these fantastic chariot races, and they would go 7 times around and back if they could survive. And of course, the Romans were involved, and the more violent it was, the better the Romans liked it, and so it was pretty fantastic to have this right by the sea. There's a lot of evidence of Christian influence in Caesarea. This is a statue of a shepherd with a sheep. Anytime you see a sheep, and a shepherd especially, sometimes you would see a ram by itself. Those were significantly placed to inform people about Jesus, the Christ, the Lamb of God, the shepherd of Israel. The ram, other times you would see the ram that comes from the Jewish tradition. They saw the ram. They went back to Abraham, who found the ram that God provided stuck in the bushes so that Abraham would not have to kill his son Isaac. And the ram, of course, took the place of his son as Jesus takes the place for us. And these are symbols that you would see throughout Israel. This, I don't know if you're able to see that. What is that? There's a cross carved into this capital. That's what these are called. Capitals are the tops of pillars upon which the other parts of the building would rest. But there are several crosses carved into many of the capitals that are in Caesarea. And of course, these would come later. These weren't during Herod's time. This would come later, but we'll see how that all came about. Here's an interesting find. I don't know if you're able to read that from where you are, but this stone reads Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And this is significant because, come on, clicker. This is the only archaeological find bearing both his name and his title. Of course, we have that in the Bible. The gospel writers recorded that Pontius Pilate was a prefect of the Romans, but there were no other extant indications that this was so until they uncovered this stone. And the story goes, this stone was repurposed, it was laid flat to be used as a seat in front of the Hippodrome. So somebody said, oh, there's Pontius Pilate, let's just sit on him, kind of a thing. That's what is thought came of this stone. So it's interesting. The significance of Caesarea. Philip the evangelist came here after teaching and baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. This is from Acts chapter 8, verse 40. Remember that story, Acts chapter 8? Spirit says to Philip, hey, go down, join yourself to this chariot. And so he did. And he saw the guy in the chariot as he was traveling along. He'd been to Jerusalem to worship, and he was going back home. He was Ethiopian. He worked for Candace, the queen. And what did Philip ask him? Do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch replied, well, how can I unless some man guide me? And so Philip got into the chariot. Where were they reading from? 53rd chapter of Isaiah. And the eunuch asked, who's the writer talking about this, himself or some other man? And what did Philip do at that point? He preached Jesus to him. And as Philip preached Jesus to him, the man understood from what Philip had said, I need to be baptized. And so he said, as they were riding along, came to some water. Here's water. What keeps me from being baptized? And so Philip baptized him into Christ, and he went on his way rejoicing. Now, you get down to the end of the chapter. Sometimes it's so great to see that news about the eunuch being baptized into Christ that you forget the rest of the chapter, but you get down, it says Philip wound up at Caesarea. So we've got the guy By the way, who was the first Gentile convert? Cornelius, coming up in chapter 10 of Acts. What about this guy, though? He was Ethiopian, but he was a Jewish convert. He was a proselyte to Judaism. So in a sense, this Ethiopian eunuch was the first Gentile convert, but not really, because he was, okay, technically he was a proselyte, but still, he goes down to Ethiopia with the gospel. Isn't that interesting? And Philip goes to Caesarea Philippi, this city that has a window to the world. Moving along. You're probably doing that now, aren't you? Because, I don't know, I got to press it about 3 times before it works. Caesarea was where Paul made his escape to Tarsus. You remember when he became a Christian in Acts chapter 9? He began immediately talking to the Jews about the Christ and proving to them through the scriptures that he was the Christ. What a turnaround Saul made. And he was so effective at that they decided, we need to kill this guy. And so the plot was made to kill Saul, and the brethren said, we need to get him out of here. They took him down to Caesarea. Why? Because there was a deep water port. They put him on a ship, sent him off to Tarsus. By the way, why Tarsus? That's where he was from. That's home. He went off to Tarsus for a while. Go see Mom. Well, I don't know that he went to see Mom. I just throw that in there. But if he went back to Tarsus and he didn't go see Mom, he'd be in trouble. The first converts among the Gentiles, Cornelius and his family, they lived here also. You can read about that in Acts chapter 10. How does God get Peter to see that it's okay to preach to the Gentiles? Well, he has this great sheet let down from heaven with all kinds of animals in it. And what's Peter told to do? Rise, kill, and eat. And what does Peter say? Oh, I can't eat anything common or unclean, because what did Peter believe? He believed he was still under the law. He still had to keep things of the law. And God says, what I've cleansed, don't you call common or unclean. And that happened 3 times. You know, when God tells you something 3 times, you need to start thinking about what he says. And Peter surmised, he understood that this is what God had meant, that the Gentiles were ready for the gospel. And so he gets an entourage ready. He goes to Caesarea after Cornelius had, of course, sent people to get him, and goes to Caesarea, preaches to Cornelius and his family, and commands them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. So the first Gentiles come into Christ in the city of Caesarea Maritima, there on the coast. Paul was kept here, and he reasoned with Felix about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. You remember reading that? You reading that about Felix? I've read that all my life, and I never really pictured where he was. I may have read Caesarea, but it never really stuck with me that it was Caesarea, because the significance of Caesarea had escaped me. But now I think I know the significance of Caesarea, at least, if nothing else, it's at least poetic. And we're talking about this city by the sea that was not there before as a deep water port, but now it's a deep water port. And now Paul is there, and he's reasoning with this Roman ruler about righteousness, about self-control, about the judgment to come. And what does he do? He trembles. Trembles when he hears these words. This is the gospel, part of the gospel going into this man's heart. And so this is happening in Caesarea. Caesarea was a port to the world where there was none before. It was just a seacoast, nothing there to bring any ships there, but now it is a port. And it opens Caesarea and Israel to the world. Fresh water is brought from afar, but from a significant place, from a place of old where God's work and will has been seen in history past. And that's where they brought the water to this city from. And then we consider that this is the home of the evangelist who taught the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip teaches the Ethiopian eunuch, and then he returns and makes his home in Caesarea, and we'll see him later on in the book of Acts as well. And this is the home of the first Gentile converts. This is why I had Daxton read that passage from Acts chapter 1. The apostles in chapter 1 still wanted to know about the establishment of, is this when you're going to bring the kingdom back to Israel? They still had this nationalistic idea of the kingdom being restored to their nation, and their nation being great and powerful. And Jesus didn't answer them directly. He said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. But What do you say to do? You go to Jerusalem, and you wait until you're endued with power from on high. And so that's what they did. They went to Jerusalem and they waited. In Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit comes on them, and they began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And people gathered in Jerusalem from 15 different nations that are listed there in Acts chapter 2 are hearing these men speak to them in their own native languages, hearing them preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to them in their own native languages. All those different nations. You got to wonder if any of those people came into Jerusalem through the port at Caesarea. And when they left Jerusalem, how did they leave? Maybe they went back to that port at Caesarea to go back to their homes. What a great thing Herod did, and he didn't even know it. He had no idea he was serving God in this way by creating a deep water port on the coast of Israel that surely would be used as a place where the gospel would go out to the rest of the world. And so Jesus told them, you're going to be witnesses. First in Jerusalem, then in Judea, then in Samaria, and then where? I like to say to Oklahoma, to the uttermost part of the earth. And to me it seems so poetically wonderful that there is this city, not built by a faithful Jewish person, not built by a member of the Lord's church, but this deep water port built by a king who was really an awful guy. God takes what he builds and uses it for the good of the kingdom and the spread of the gospel. I think it's a marvelous story, and it's the way it works in our lives all the time. God uses us in good ways to bring about blessings in our lives, but he also uses those who have no idea they're doing his will or even want to do his will. That's the nature of God, to be so efficient and so effective. And so we see this ancient city used for the good and the glory of God. So many things to see here. But the question now is, has the gospel reached you? Gospel's gone out into the whole world, to the uttermost parts of the world, but has it reached you? Are you still an uttermost part who has not yet put Jesus Christ on in baptism? Have you come to faith in him as the Son of God and as your Savior? If that is not the case with you, I want to talk to you today. There's any number of other people here who want to talk to you. Just grab one of us, talk to us. You're welcome to come down front as we sing the invitation song and let us know what your desire is. We'd like to teach you the gospel, like to baptize you into Christ, like to pray with you, whatever your desire is for any help or assistance this morning. That's what we're asking. That's what we're inviting you to do as we stand and sing this song together. Titus, will you lead us?